Right, so I'll kick off. For those who don't know me, I'm Emma. I'm the director of Fishing into the Future. Fishing into the Future is a fisherman-led charity, and our mission is to share knowledge and create connections, with the idea that we do events and calls like this so people are better prepared to work together on fisheries management and research. So these are our Fit for Talks, Fishing into the Future talks. So I'm just like also letting people in as I'm chatting to you. So these are our Fishing into the Future talks. These are a series of talks that we do, and we aim to bring interesting topics and speakers to fishermen and people in the industry, and encourage a conversation that encourages people to join in on this conversation, to get connected, to get informed, but also to prioritize fishermen's voices and questions within these scenarios. So it's supposed to be a safe, informal, it's supposed to be like a fun environment for us all to be here and just have a chat. So it's no big pressure here. Just a few notes. If you could stay muted when you're not speaking, but we're really happy for you to have your camera on. I think in this world we live in now, where we do so much online, it's just really nice to be able to sometimes see each other's faces and see who each other is. But no pressure if you want to keep your camera off or you haven't got the signal for that, especially if you're at sea. We take an approach to engage in a constructive dialogue and focus on constructive solutions. So if we can try and keep it constructive, that's really useful for us to be able to keep doing these and keep getting kind of good speakers on. We prioritize fishermen's voices as well. So can everyone, when you're asking questions, when you're giving answers, try and be brief, and we might not come to you in the order that you're asking questions, because we just want to really be sure that people in industry have the chance to speak up. Just to note, the first part of this session is recorded and we put it online, but the conversation, I might forget to turn off the recording, but we won't be publicizing the conversation because we just want to keep it like a chat, like a place people feel safe to have a conversation and ask questions. So yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to our host, who's our vice chair, Adrian Bartlett, who I'm sure is somewhere on here. I've lost everyone from my screen now, but Adi, if you unmute and speak up, there you are. You can kick off for us. So thanks for joining.
All right, thank you, Emma. Just before we start with our speakers, I would like to thank everybody that is speaking today with various topics and everybody that's joined. This is our 9th Fit Talk now since COVID, and hopefully we'll be back on the road later on in the year with our workshops. And today we're talking, well, we've titled it Fishing to Net Zero. Our industry is still in transitional, and we're not quite certain which way to go. So with our fantastic speakers, we've got Cara Brydson on the call, and Cara is at hand as well, as we go through the speakers. And after the speakers, we will have hopefully 45 minutes for Q&As. And as Emma said, if I can't see the hand up, if you put your hand up after that for any questions, we will get to you. But we'll keep it short and sweet. It'll all be logged down for future talks. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker this evening, and that is Cara Brydson. And thank you, Cara.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me all right? Is all good? Great. Listen, thank you so much for this. Don't know me, I'm Cara Brydson, Fisheries Innovation and Sustainability, and we're a coalition of folk coming together to coordinate and, importantly, for something, as we're going to talk about later, that's as expensive as this, to try and help leverage investment for innovation in seafood. And our board includes retailers and processors, as well as folk like Seafish and Fishmongers Company. And we have a stakeholder committee, including lots of people, some of you are on here, to try and shape the work that we do. Although it's about innovation, it's about practical innovation as well. And I think that's a really important place to start today, because I know when we started looking at things like net zero vessels, there was a few folk that were like, what fresh hell is this? What are we starting to talk? There's so many other things to think, so many concerns. Why worry about this now? But actually, it's so important that we do start this conversation now. And I'm really grateful for your time and for Emma and the board of Fishing into the Future to allow us to have this conversation. are changes coming at us and coming at us fast. And some of those, yes, are to do with the political timelines. So you've got the Scottish and UK governments committed to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045, 2050, relatively. And there are also really important targets between then and now for us to reach, and lots of government policies and funding policies related to those. How do we support fishing in supporting the delivery of these net zero targets, including on vessel emissions? But it's really important to say it's not just about political targets and policies, it's about retailer commitments as well. Marks and Spencer's or Sainsbury's are members of FIS. I'll talk generally though about the sort of commitments that are out there. So some of them are pledging net zero by 2040, and that includes, really importantly for us, these scope 3 requirements. And that scope 3 means emissions from everything that is sold in the store. And they want to make sure that they can reach these net zero targets, and they're being really vocal about them. Now, if you do not feed into supply chains that are related to certain processors or retailers, you might think, well, you know, why do I need to worry about this? But very soon you will have to show how, as a fishing business, people are committing to these net zero targets. So we're already being asked by government, by supply chains, by customers, by the public to show how we're supporting reducing our reliance on and it's also true that we need to do this because of affordability of diesel, competition from other kinds of proteins that are doing this sort of work, and also, of course, you know, to show that we're doing the right thing in the climate emergency, and that we're part of this modern carbon conscious production. So we have one of our many mantras in FIS is nothing about us without us, meaning that any innovation around seafood has to have fishing businesses and the seafood experts right at the centre of it, because the alternative is that changes that come with innovation won't work with us. And that is so important within the things we're talking about today, because port infrastructure, access to fuels, skills and training, funding for demonstration projects, finance packages, access to funding, all of those things need to be fit for purpose for us, for the fishing industry. And as somebody, a skipper that we asked to go on a knowledge exchange over to Norway came back and said, gosh, you know, the kinds of packages that are available there, a wrong move here for us could have serious consequences for the viability of our fishing industry. So that's why, to get to the point, a few years ago, FIS organised this Vessels of the Future workshop, so actually, gosh, a year and a bit ago, Vessels of the Future workshop in Glasgow. And that was the first time getting people together to say, well, what does it mean for us, this net zero transition to net zero? And one of the things we agreed was we needed, you know, a lot of people coming together, and we were really delighted when Seafish convened its Vessels of the Future forum, and we'll hear from Mike on that later. We in FIS, very small, we decided to focus on understanding what the fishing vessel might look like. And that's when we were delighted that, that Macduff Ship Design agreed to help us with this. And again, it was really practical pieces of work. And you know that that's true, what I'm telling you, because we took our work to the Scottish Skipper Expo. We wouldn't have got out alive had we been there going, look, it's really easy to transition to net zero. You know, we were being really practical about some of the difficulties, the financial, the regulatory, and the technical barriers to getting us where we need to be if we are to help deliver these net zero targets. So the first piece of work by Duncan will talk about it, helped us understand that these changes will also could create skills and infrastructure and deficits, but offshore and onshore. So looking at how would we have the specialist engineers, where's the maintenance people, where's the infrastructure? So suddenly there was all these other pieces of the jigsaw had to come together. And with the Clyde Fishermen's Trust, we got people together to start thinking about what might be needed in terms of skills and support to help us get to this truly, what we call a, you know, a truly just transition So not just looking at the low-hanging fruit, not just thinking about either the larger ports or the static smaller vessels, but leaving no sectors or communities behind. And I think that Elaine will help touch on that. But really, we have, as a community of people starting to think about this, unless we bite the bullet and actually develop vessels working on these alternative propulsions or net zero fuels, then we will not understand really what the costs and the skills needs and the capacities and the consenting, all of this stuff we're really just guessing at until we get on with developing these net zero vessels. But do the funding mechanisms work for us? I worry sometimes that the pots of money, although absolutely amazing to have that access, but are they too big? Are they too small? Is the match funding requirement okay? So there's lots of questions about how will the funding work to help us support with this? Because as we've heard and we'll hear from Hans and Dougie, those early adopters who have really tried this, it has been difficult. It's super, super hard to make business sense, how to make these decisions, informed financial decisions about when and how to do this. And no individual businesses should be expected to do this on their own. No early adopter can possibly have to do this on their own. We need advice and support and funding to help people make those changes, and so that we can learn what we need to do to create that groundswell of people coming through. Talked about the, I could get feedback there, sorry. Jigsaw of high cost, low availability of novel fuels. Let's think about space and storage and infrastructure and training. We need cross-sector finance and support to help us get all this together and to make sure that whatever we do next, it's fit for purpose for us and that our fishing businesses can stay safe and competitive is a really important point. So unless there's anything from our wonderful chair, I think I can hand over to Elaine unless there's any questions about that bit.
No, thank you, Cara, and that was absolutely brilliant. I know you've been doing some fantastic work up in Scotland for quite a few years. Maybe England can take lead. Yeah, well,
excuse me, we are UK wide now. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah. Oh, we didn't realise that. You'll have to pass us some details then. And we're championing you down on the south coast. Yeah, our next speaker is Elaine White from the Clyde Fisheries Associations. Okay, Elaine, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, but thank you for, first of all, thank you very much for having us. I have to say, it's not just myself that's been involved in this work. In fact, it's been my colleagues, Johnny Walker and Fiona Matheson, who've been really involved in developing a lot of this work along with Cara. Fiona developed the Clyde vision for our area, which is really a kind of business plan for what the area needs in going forward as a sector for fishing, because the Clyde has been particularly hard hit by a selection of different policies over the years. And we now have one of the oldest fleets in the country and ageing at the quickest rate. So, I mean, we were very aware that we have to do something because we have fallen behind due to a number of different policies. And it was fantastic for Cara to come along and work with us on this type of work. I've got to admit, this has been an excellent body to work with because it's one of those bodies that actually finds out what fishermen needs and what they have to do, which we find is very, very rare actually. I remember speaking to a funder who was very well intentioned and said they didn't want to do the basics because they wanted to challenge fishermen. And if there's one thing that fishing communities don't need at the moment, it's extra challenges. We are very, very challenged. It's actually the basics that we want to be getting on with to make everyone's lives a little bit better. So, I mean, I think in terms of net zero, I think it's really important to say from the kickoff that fishing is a very low carbon way of collecting, harvesting food in comparison to different types of harvest. So, I mean, we already are off to a good start. And I don't think that we spread that good news as much as we should. But I think Cara's right. Whilst we see policy changes and pressure from different areas to kind of conform to new targets, then we want to be doing our bit. We want to be doing the best that we possibly can. But I think there's also that caveat of doing what's realistic as well, and timescales that it's actually potentially possible to do. So, I mean, I think to say that the kind of general climate in fishing is what will influence how much we can do and how much we can innovate. And if we're running to stand still, it's not the greatest place to be. So, I mean, most of you will know that we've had highly protected marine areas, inshore caps, NPAs, PMFs, lots of marine planning, lots of different policies coming at us. And quite often they seem to come from the side, and I think Cara had said nothing about us without us. I think there's a lot of that has happened in the last few years in fishing, and this is really great that we can actually have this discussion now and be front-footing in it. Now, Cara had mentioned that some of the fishermen were saying, what fresh hell is this, when they heard about and she's right. I had to do a lot of chatting to some of our members to convince them to get involved or to come, because they just felt it was another thing on their plate. The positive thing about that is after they came out of the workshop, they said that was the best event they had been to in years. Now, the reason it was the best event that they had been to in years is because they felt, I think, that they could have a role at the very beginning in shaping policy and also speaking about what they think is practically needed. And that isn't the way a lot of other policies are going. I think it's empowering people to get involved in a discussion, realizing that we might be some way away from things, but it's doing it on the positive foot instead of feeling that something is coming down from the top. I know a lot of fishermen who wince slightly when they hear the phrase just transition, because it hasn't felt just in a lot of areas. And I think to come out of that workshop, to actually have some space to think about what might work and what might not work was one of the most positive things for them. They felt empowered, and I think that's really important. So, I mean, Cara's mentioned most of the things that I think are going to be important for especially small scale fishermen going forward. I mean, the change in maintenance. We know that in certain areas, and it's not just the west coast of Scotland, but in other areas, we have depopulation in rural areas and islands, and it's how we can attract people into those areas as well. Nobody wants to come if they think they're going to be joining an industry which is behind or has not a long time to go. And I think if we're talking about how we involve ourselves in new technology and innovation and the net zero work with electrifying the fleet potentially in the future, that feels like something positive for young people to kind of get involved with and say, well, there is a future here, it's a different type of future, and this is a skill set that will last me in going forward and is potentially transferable. I think that's something to be talked about. Could electrical mechanics have some kind of transferable skill? You know, those types of discussions are really exciting, and it's also exciting to young people because that's more of that's the world that they know to a certain extent. So it's really great to kind of have those conversations. I do think as well the infrastructure point is going to be key, because there's a lot of areas at the moment that struggle with infrastructure on the current fishing boats that we have, things like, you know, even basic things like davits, electricity points, etc., and traffic are going to be really important going forward. Because what we are seeing is a marine squeeze now. We have a lot of additional Sorry. We have a lot of additional users in the marine environment now, and I think it's really important that if we are thinking about electrifying, and they are too, how we've got enough infrastructure to support what they're doing going forward. I mean, now if you go to a lot of ports, there's a lot of renewables boats and maintenance boats, those types of things, and it's how fishing can fit in with that. So yeah, no, I think this is a really exciting topic for us, and I think for fishermen to turn around and say, this is the first time we've been able to have space to think about planning something in a recent policy, it is very important. So yeah, I mean, thank you for having us. I think my last sentence would probably just be capacity. And I think most people would want to get involved with this, but we really have to be aware that funding is tight for people. capacity is difficult, and particularly as policies continue to grow, everybody wants something different from people. So it's how we think about how we find that space, and funding definitely can be a challenge, particularly for smaller players. So I think that's things that we have to take forward and going forward with the projects. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. That was very, very interesting, and we can see you know, that Fishing into the Future can continue to keep these talks going. You know, I think we're on the right track. I think it is, you're correct. We need fishermen now to try to take lead, and because it's important to keep the industry going for the younger ones. Right, we're going to hand over now to Magnus Johnson, Dr. Magnus Johnson, I should say. And he's from the University of Hull, and he's been looking into researching into transition into net zero. Thank you, Magnus.
That's great. Thanks, Adrian. That's my posh name, Dr. Johnson. I don't usually get called that. Can you share?
It's written on my notes from Emma, so you can.
That's it. Do you share screen, Emma? Is that your job, or is it? Oh, I do it.
You should have permission to. I'm happy to share for you as well. I'm also playing whack-a-rat with the mute button on some people, which I know isn't their fault. It's that sometimes it gets unmuted by accident. But if you can share, if not, I've got it ready and up to go.
Okay, let's just. We use Teams here. You know, it's a nightmare. Where am I going?
You got it. Should be green button, bottom, middle. If not, I'll do it.
Yeah, can you do it? It's giving me. I've got two screens. It's giving me.
Don't get stressed. It's fine. I got it. Right. Can everyone see my screen?
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay. Some of you will have heard this already. Feel free to fall asleep. That's what my students do. But it was an interesting piece of work that we did. It was commissioned by the NFFO. We had some support from some NGOs, but we had also had, most importantly, we had a lot of support from people in the fishing industry. You can see a kind of who's who of supporters on the left there. And the remit of the work was to look at under 10 fishing vessels and to go around and start speaking to what Elaine was saying a minute ago, listen to fishermen and try and find out what their views are at this point in time about the potential for electrification. And when we started, I thought they're not going to be interested. You know, they're going to be, like Elaine said, there are so many other things on their plate that I'm having to worry about at the moment. But actually, it was really good experience. I can see your WhatsApp, Emma. Is there anything interesting, anything juicy in there? No. Okay, so we're concentrating on under 10 meter, small scale vessels, and I was using Jerry Percy's definition, which is a boat that lands fresh fish every day, as a kind of definition for that. So they're day boats, and I'm speaking to the converted here, but the reason why I feel they're important is every one of those men and women that's working at sea is supporting between 4 and 7 people ashore. So they're a really important part of some of our communities and cultures. Next slide, please, Emma. So what we did was I ambushed fishermen. Basically, we went around. That's a picture of me and Sergey and Derek Meredith down in Brydson, and we went round and ambushed fishermen and spoke to them about this idea about how they use their propulsion systems. Asked them what size engines they've got, how much fuel are they using, and at this time, fuel in Bridlington was £1.30 a litre, so it was at the forefront of everybody's minds at that time, which may be why we got so much in the way of attention. But we chose 3 different ports, and it is nothing to do with how beautiful they are and how lovely they are to visit. So we chose Brixham, the Yorkshire coast, and Orkney. Ostensibly because they have different fleets. So Bridlington's kind of dominated by potters, Orkney's got a slightly more diverse fleet, and then Devon has a really diverse fleet. It's got a lot of different people doing different things, and we wanted to speak to people doing different things in order to try and understand how they use their propulsion systems. So next slide, please. When we spoke to fishermen, there's some interesting things here. So obviously there's a difference in power, engine power depending on which sort of fishermen you're talking to. So trawlers and dredgers tend to have more powerful engines than potters and netters. So static gear boats are less powerful. And fuel use is obviously much higher in mobile boats than it is in boats that are using static gear. And that was interesting. But what was interesting as well was to talk about how they use their engines. So when I speak to somebody who uses static gear, and a lot of this is going to be really obvious to you guys, but maybe not to people that write policies. So somebody who uses static gear goes out to their gear and at full chat, and then they mess around pulling in the pots, and then they move to the next gear and then they pull in their pots, so that their engine isn't running at full steam all day. If you're a trawler or a dredger, you go out at 70% and you steam around at 70% all day, because you're either moving or you're dragging your gear behind you. Interesting thing about, so some of the interesting things we found out from skippers was they never turn their engines off. Why would you? Because if it doesn't start again, you're in trouble. And that's a particular feature of combustion engines, because it might not start again. If you have a 100 horsepower engine in your boat, it's never giving you 100 horsepower, it's only giving you 70. And that's the difference between, because you run it about 3/4, that's the difference between an electric engine and a combustion engine. Combustion engines, you don't run them 100%. You can do that with an electric engine. You can also switch an electric engine off. A lot of fuel is used by boats sitting at idle when they're not doing anything. We saw an example of that. No, I'll carry on. So next slide, please, Emma. So the fishing industry is already transitioning towards lower use of fuel, so lower carbon cost for landed catch. One of the ways of doing that is you've got the big pelagic boats that fish out in the middle of the North Sea, and those have very, very good carbon cost figures because they're very, very efficient. But a lot of the small scale sector have moved away from trawling and are now using static gear. And we saw that really powerfully in Bridlington between the 70s and more recently. And the whole fleet changed in Bridlington, not overnight, but it felt like it really. So they went from being a whitefish port through to being a potting port. And now lobster's the big lobster. Now Bridlington is the biggest lobster port in Europe. And that's a transition away from using large engines and heavy fuel. So that's been driven by a combination of things, including legislation, difficulties with quota, the opportunity to catch things with static gear at the time being easier than trying to catch stuff with trawling, sort of in a legislative way. So next slide, please. But I think what it demonstrates, that Bridlington picture demonstrates that fishermen, there's always an innovator in the harbour, isn't there? There's always one person in the harbour that will be the first person that tries something. And so in Bridlington, they innovated their way out of a problem with whitefish and moved over to sort of static gear. Right, so we started looking at, I had an engineer, Sergey, did some sums for us about what the combination of electric motor generator and generator would be, and what would be the ideal combination. So if you look at the top left hand graph there, and you can see that we've got a black line at the top, which is the electric motor that's pushing the boat through the water. And you can see that for the top left hand graph, the motor is so the motor is used for steaming out to the grounds, and then it goes down to a lower rate when it's picking up pots. We're talking about a potting boat here, and that's a pattern of use for all these boats, but they have different ratios of battery for them. So with a small battery in the top left-hand side there, you can see when the boat leaves harbour, the generator has to be running, and as soon as it's switched off, the battery starts to decrease, the charge in the battery starts to decrease. If you've got a big battery, then that decrease takes longer. If you have a really large battery, you can run a small generator all day at its optimum pace, say 60% of its running speed. So it's using the least amount of fuel. It's not going up and down. So one of the things that is expensive in terms of fuel on boats is when you're running up and down through res, so you're at full chat and then you're half, and then you're off, then if you can run constantly at one particular rate, you get the best use of diesel that you can get. And we looked at this and we found that if in an ideal world, you could cut your costs of diesel, or it would be diesel, to about 40% of the costs that you have at the moment in a potting boat. Next slide, please. but it's not just about the engines, actually. And just to mention this in passing, really, we looked at a study that was done up in Scotland on a salmon barge, and they found they put a monitoring system onto one of the barges that's used for feed, and they found that they could get 25% saving just by the change in behaviour of the skipper, because when he knew he was being watched, he thought, right, I'm going to try and minimize the amount of fuel that I'm using. So he had a monitor in the wheelhouse that told him how much fuel he was using at any one time. And as soon as he realized he was being watched, he started playing the game. You know, so if you got a fancy car that's got a sort of fuel use monitor in it, you're always trying to get it up to 32 miles per gallon or 35 miles per gallon or whatever. So the skipper was doing that as well. And they found they got a 25% saving in fuel use just by changing behavior. And that's an important point. Again, something that Elaine mentioned, that quite often funders want to see us go from zero to hero in one jump. And actually, there's a whole lot of other steps that we could be doing in between getting to full sort of net zero. We want to work our way to that slowly. Anyway, but on the way to sort of having electrified boats, there are some opportunities. There are early adopters like Hans and Dougie, but there's Sarah Reddy's boat down in the Brydson, the Dart Deputy, which they use for potting. That's been switched over to electric motors, and they've had to sort of fight to get there. You'll hear more about this from Dougie and Hans in a minute, I think. We are seeing in other parts of the world, so in Norway now you get these chargers on the quayside, so boats can come in and they can charge up, and that's great. And I started thinking, well, is that ever going to happen in the UK? And when I went around the UK, I found that you know, a lot of harbours have got big car parks on them. It's the places where fishermen used to mend their nets. And nowadays they're used as car parks because the council can make lots of money from them. Cars are becoming electric. More and more people are starting to adopt electric cars. So those car parks eventually are going to have to start giving the opportunity for drivers to charge up. Now, if you've got a car park full of electric cars or charging facilities, it's not difficult to see that actually that could be good for boats as well. And we could see the facilities developing for boats to be able to charge up in the harbour as well. And that would be a really good thing. So last slide, please, Emma. Right. So the conclusion I came to really at the end of it all was it's all about efficiency, and that's what we need to be driving for. So you can make savings already, fishermen can make savings already by just making sure the propulsion system is as good as possible. So it has the right propeller, it's going at the right revs, it's the appropriately sized engine. I spoke to guys that are swapping big engines out for small ones when the prices for fuel was high. The boat design, currently a lot of potters are big square bricks in the water, you know, and we may have to move to a sort of design of boat that resembles the beautiful long thin boats that we used to have a long time ago. Infrastructure needs to be there. We need charging points for boats. It needs to be there so that they can start to adopt this kind of practice, because as Cara was saying, you can't expect individual businesses to do this. They need to be facilitated, they need to be helped to do it. Behavior of fishermen, one of the things that I want to try and do is get a monitoring system that you can put on a boat. The skipper I want to try and do it with a mobile phone. We are trying to get there, but it's not there yet. But just something the skipper can have in his wheelhouse. It tells him how much fuel he's using at any one time and how much speed they're, you know, what the speed is, what the fuel use is, all the rest of it. And that will help them improve their behavior and make them more efficient. And the last thing there, policy needs to be there to encourage, not prevent people from moving in this direction. They really, the fleet needs help in order to get to where we want them to get. And that's it. Thank you very much. God, that was a rant through.
No, thank you, Magnus. It's definitely interesting, and it's another outlook on trying to get to net zero. So no doubt there'll be a few questions coming your way in the Q&A sessions. We're going to go over now to Douglas Churnside and Han Uncles, and Cara is going to be involved in this next little section, and they're just local vessel owners from Argyll, and they've got an experience of converting under a 10 vessel. So I'll leave it to you, Cara. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so Hans and Dougie, we've got 5 minutes to get your last, well, on Hans's side of things, years of everything you've been going through, and Doug, everything that you're living through just now. So I am here to try and kind of create some semblance of order, but I think it's important to say that it's important to say that, you know, this is not what they've been doing is nothing at all to do with groups like FES or others trying to kind of encourage. This is the industry innovating itself, doing it without help from anybody else. And, you know, we've just come in maybe after the fact to say, gosh, isn't that awful? You shouldn't have been going through all this yourself. And how can we help in the future? And I think the other thing that I want to say is that it's interesting that although they're from the same area, we're talking different boats, different fishing patterns, but already we're hearing people say, well, that's already been tried, or Hans has already done it. No, we haven't ticked any boxes. There's still a need to see, you know, all the different kinds of small static vessels, as well as all the other vessels. So I think it's important to show that there's such differences in what they're trying to do and the kind of support we can access them. So I'm going to start with Hans. Hans, explain what you've done and why you did it. And you've got a minute, go.
Right, I've taken my trousers off because I'm in a room that's far too hot. That's what I've done. I've taken a Cygnus 21, a scabby 1978-year-old tired boat, completely refitted it and electrified it. It's now solar powered, and it's totally surprised me how well it's performing. I'm doing 8-hour days, doing maybe between 20 25 miles a day and using a third of the battery capacity. I can replace that with the solar in 2 days. So fishing lobsters, I'm fishing every second, third day, and with sunshine, that's completely, since the boat's been in the water for 6 or 8 weeks, it's been entirely solar powered, not to plug it in.
So you're an entirely different, happier man than the last time that we met, when you were getting through some of the paperwork and the finance and others. Can you just tell, well, what made you want to do this in the first place? And did you expect it to take the time that it did? And then tell us a bit about what you've had to go through in terms of accessing funding.
So what made me want to do it so difficult? I mean, ultimately it's an environmental decision. That's primarily my thought. But also, I wasn't seeing all the tech was sitting there to do that. The hardware is, the leisure industry's full of that hardware. So this equipment's there to do it, but it was just not happening at all in the fishing industry. And then I'm thinking they're talking all the net zero by 2045, 2050. See, if you're not actually ahead of that, if you're left behind, you've had it. You've absolutely had it if you get left behind with that. And so am I feather in my own nest? Quite possibly with that, quite possibly. But what would be my initial reasons would be I'm concerned with the water's warming and something needs to get done, and I wasn't seeing anything getting done. So that would be my drive. And then I'm sitting there with 40 years of fishing behind me, diving, potting, and I was an apprentice boat builder in life school. I'm sitting there with all the ability and the facilities to do the conversion and the boat, and every penny I had, pensions going into it, the whole lot, it's going into it. So I saw myself as being one of the very few people in the country that was actually capable of actually getting something started. And like you're saying, if nobody bites the bullet and does it, it's just not going to happen. There had to be some kind of proof of concept.
So Hans, given that you had the will to do it, you're a boat builder, you had the technical expertise and you decided to do it, it sounds like it was really easy, was it?
Oh, a piece of piss. There's no bother.
What's your language, sir?
Sorry, a piece of wee. So yes, the building the boat was straightforward. So to get through the funding was probably the hardest thing. With the funding came a deadline. So I ended up getting 35 grand out of funders, but the cost that came at was really quite. I found it quite damaging to me because they put a time scale on it. I didn't get approved for the funding till August last year, and the whole project had to be completed by the end of March, the financial year. So that really, and then, but then what you throw into that as well is that I had to make the boat compliant with the MCA on a thing that they had no MSNs or MG marine guidance notices to cover. So we were writing the book for the electric thing, really. In retrospect, the MCA have done their bit. They've got me through the coding in time. At the end of it, they worked to get there. But the whole process, I'm sitting facing financial ruin if I can't get the boat coded, and that was a real problem for me, a real problem, because I didn't know, you know, I had absolutely no idea whether I was going to get through the coding or not, and I was genuinely looking at financial ruin. So that side of it, with the deadline of the funding and the unknown to the MCA, was probably the most stressful thing I've ever done in my life. But
so Douglas, I'll bring you in there. Saying that it has been the proverbial, as you said, it's been dead easy. What on earth made you do what you're doing, and can you explain why it's different to what Anne's has been doing?
Right. So yeah, I kind of started with a really small open boat, about 16 feet, and that was when the technology was really small. There was very little choice, and the costs were extortionate. So I just went for an outboard with a small boat, and I could dive from it. And then Hans got the 21-foot boat and proved the concept a bit further, and did the inboard engine, well, inboard batteries, and a sort of bigger version with an electric hauler. And then what I've done now is bought a 32-foot version of the same Cygnus hull that Hans has got, but 32 feet long, and I'm planning to try and electrify that and do creels and diving from it. So it's a sort of next kind of size of vessel up, but it's probably something that's dotted all around the whole UK shore, and I think it'd be something that would make a fantastic demonstration project. So that's where we could really get funding, hopefully, and we could sort of take it round the coast, showing it off, getting fishermen on board with it, and actually do a day's fishing in different ports, lifting their gear. And I'm pretty sure 95% of them, their jaws will drop when they realise what is possible from just pure electric. So that's my kind of thinking with buying this vessel, which I've just bought a couple of months ago. It's running on a 6-cylinder diesel engine just now, and I'll probably run that through the summer, lifting lobster gear and diving from it, just to get some figures and facts on what I'm using fuel-wise, and what I would need to transfer it to electric battery pack size and size of electric motor.
Okay. And given that there have been pots of money for various kinds of vessel modification, did you think about going for any of those pots? What was your experience of trying to access funding?
So what with the first boat, the small boat?
Well, what are you trying to do? What are you going to do now?
What I'm doing now, yeah. So I mean, I've been looking at it briefly, and you've been sort of keeping me right, because I get it wrong an awful lot, and just seeing where the funding is, and whether you can make that funding with what you're trying to do. Whether it's like you said earlier, you said some of the projects are, you know, for like start at $500,000 and go up to millions, which is probably for a bigger scale sort of offshore vessel, maybe a new build vessel rather than retrofitting it to something. But then there's the smaller stuff, which is like up to 40,000, which isn't quite enough money to do what I want to do. So there's a hole in the middle that I'm sort of looking for funding. And I don't know, you know all about the funding, whether you can match two different fundings together, all the sort of holes and hoops to jump through with that. If there was some sort of pot that kind of catered for either the inshore or the nearshore fleet, I would call them. Because the offshore, I think, is into the sort of £500,000 boats, that tow nets, maybe the pelagic sector, but then the inshore and the nearshore sort of would overlap in places depending on what you were doing. And I think the 10-metre vessel that I've got could demonstrate that really well with static gear, that is, not towing, but just static gear and diving.
Well, in Denmark, they've just committed 10 million to fishing vessel greening. So I think, well, we can maybe meet somewhere in the middle. That would be fantastic.
Okay.
Now, Adrian, we've gone over our sort of 5 to 7 minutes, and I'm sure there'll be more intelligent questions from others on the group when we get to the Q&A. So shall we close this part there and move on and ask people to think of questions for them at the next stage?
Yeah, no, that'd be brilliant, Cara. Thank you, Hans and Dougie, on how you're moving forward up there. But it's very interesting to hear what's happening on the ground now. We're just moving over to the next speaker now with Duncan Boag from Macduff Ship Design, and they've been working with various different concepts and designs and different technologies. So over to you, Duncan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Duncan from Macduff Ship Design. I'm a naval architect here and spend a lot of my time designing fishing boats that are built both at the shipyard in Macduff and elsewhere in the UK or abroad. We were at the FIS Vessels of the Future event over a year ago now, and then after that I've had a lot of conversations with Cara FIS, who has then got us to do a couple of reports for her, looking into concept designs for fishing vessels. The first phase really looked at different types of fuel that would be available and effectively the pros and cons and what vessels they'd be suitable for. And then the second phase, looking more in detail at the better options identified in the first phase and trying to make some concept arrangements for those boats. So I think what I'm going to talk about at the moment is a little bit about the different fuels and some of the pros and cons of them, and then I'll touch on some of the concept designs that we've done as well. So the first fuel to probably talk about is hydrogen. It seems to be the big buzzword whenever you hear about net zero. It's relatively easy to make if you have clean electricity. You can electrolyze it from water. It is, however, quite difficult to store. You've got to compress it up to 350 or more bar, or cool it down to negative 253 degrees. Both of those make it quite difficult. It also, because of the makeup of hydrogen, it needs a lot of volume to store. If it's in liquid form, it's probably about 4 times the volume of diesel for the equivalent amount of energy. And if it's as compressed, it could be 8 to 14 times as much. So that's obviously going to cause some level of difficulty. Another challenge with it is that it is very explosive. So you have to be very careful with your fuel handling systems. The next fuel that we looked at was ammonia, which is being touted by a lot of the bigger shipping companies as a good option. One of the main difficulties with it is that it's very toxic. So you need very good protection systems on the boat. Otherwise you could have a sort of significant incident that would be, fatal. So one of the big challenges as well is that it's a gas at ambient conditions. So it needs to be either cooled down or compressed to make it a liquid for storage, which increases the difficulty of its storage system. The next fuel is LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, which is basically methane. It can be produced in a green manner from hydrogen, and then you mix it with carbon dioxide captured from the environment. It needs to be cryogenically stored in tanks that are very cold, which is probably the biggest challenge that it has. It's also very explosive, which is part of why it's a good fuel, but is a challenge to the safe operation of the boat. The next fuel is methanol. It's got low flash points, so again, there's issues around the handling and making sure that's done in a safe way. And it does have toxic vapor, so you've got to be very careful where there might be any leaks. At the moment, there's not much methanol available that's net zero, but there is large companies like Maersk heavily investing in net zero methanol production. The big question is over how much availability and at what cost that will be. And then the final sort of newer ways of doing things is just using electricity and storing it in batteries, much like what Hans is doing in his boat. That works on small scale vessels, not operating for a long period of time, but it is significantly heavier and larger than the equivalent volume for diesel, and that makes it very difficult to do on vessels that are operating further offshore for longer periods. It should probably become the cheapest option as we get lots of green energy on the go. And it can also be used with all the other fuels to make a sort of hybrid setup where you get some of the benefits that Magnus was talking about in his presentation, where you can keep your energy manufacturer, whether that's a generator or your main engine, at a more efficient rate and for more time. There are some options in terms of diesel, which would be like a biodiesel or a hydrogenated vegetable oil. It's unlikely that they'll ever become economic, but are worth keeping in mind. It's also possible to synthetically make net zero diesel, but that would be a very expensive operation, and I don't think is something that's likely to happen. In phase 2, we looked at 3 different types of boat. One of them was a 10-meter creel boat, which is effectively the boat that Douglas has bought and is about to start doing, and how we could replace that to net zero. The first version we looked at was an electric boat with batteries, and that looks like it works very well as a solution. The 2 big challenges are the cost of the batteries and the electrical system is significantly more than doing that vessel on diesel. The other one is that you make a big compromise on your potential range, as you're probably setting up the battery capacity for 1 or 2 trips, whereas if you had it as a diesel vessel, you could do 10 or 14 trips probably without really challenging the diesel tank capacity. But beyond that, it looks a very plausible way to move forward. We also looked at a methanol version, so that's an internal combustion engine working on methanol, and it's a very plausible way of doing it, but we did need to make the hull bigger and make it out of steel to make that work, and that's obviously going to have an impact on cost, but it's certainly a plausible way to move forward as well. And I think the biggest benefit of that over the electric is that you could fuel up for 10 to 14 trips and be less reliant on infrastructure. The other 2 boats that we looked at was something that was about a 15-meter Nephrops trawler and a whitefish trawler at the 24-meter registered length mark. The results for both of these kind of came out very similar, so I'm going to kind of talk about them together. There was the methanol version, which ended up being about 20% longer than the diesel parent vessel and had a similar increase in gross tonnage. Effectively, the fuel can't be stored in the engine room because of its low flash point. It needs to be stored in a tank that's inside the cofferdam space to make sure that we don't have any leaks that could be toxic or could have a low flash point incident. That is basically where all that extra length comes from. On this boat, the volume that we added to it is more than what the weight was, so we would be able to work on the hull form and fine it off and probably improve the vessel. For the whitefish vessel of that, I did a cost analysis with the shipyard, and we found that it would be somewhere between 25 to 45% more expensive than the diesel version, but it could be significantly more than that for the first of class, where there's a lot of uncertainty around the availability of equipment and how the MCA will look at approval. We also looked at an LNG version for both the Nephrops and the whitefish boat. It was larger again, it was 30% longer and a similar increase in GT to the diesel vessel. It similarly has to have a cofferdam space for the tanks, but they need to be specialist cylindrical tanks because the LNG is at a low temperature, so it needs insulated tanks. It's also at pressure, so they need to be that cylindrical shape, which isn't very efficient for space for fitting in.
Duncan, am I right to link you up with people with some more options? We've just got a few more people to get to, so I'm going to try and keep everyone down to the 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Is that all right? Sorry to cut you short.
Yeah.
But obviously we can link
Duncan.
up with Duncan and Macduff Ship Design for all of them. And I think you've got this in a report, haven't you, as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Duncan.
Yeah, no, thanks, Duncan. Obviously, there's challenges with all different types of fuels, and we are a little bit wary of time. You know, this call is ending at 5:30, but we can extend if need be. It's a very interesting topic. I'd like to move on now to our next speaker, or next two speakers, Fiona Taylor, Head of Sea Fisheries, and Ronnie McBride, Fishery Grants, from the DAERA of Northern Ireland. And I think they're chatting about a trip they had in Norway. Okay, thank you, Fiona.
I'll nip in first, Adrian. Ronnie's going to do the first little bit of this presentation, basically on the key lessons on the Norwegian trip, and then Fiona's coming in to see what we've applied to our climate action plan in terms of future and the support of the industry and the way forward. Emma, can you put up the screens? I'm going to fly through these. There's sorry. Emma has a few. Here we go. Well, basically, in Northern Ireland for the past year, we have got industry, be it industry representative groups, fishermen, together, policymakers, engineers, port authorities, marine architects, and fuel suppliers. Really, this past year, we've been looking at net zero and what we can do to progress towards that by 2050. Very clear, there's no easy fix, but we have provided a few pounds of support for that group to go and look at what can and can't be done. And we've got a good little bit of background on possibilities from going back to sails to nuclear and discarding some things and looking at others and saying we need some further investigation. But basically, industry did advise us that they thought Norway was well ahead on progressing towards net zero, and they asked us to fund a trip to Norway, to Bergen and Trondheim, to talk to people that were more ahead than Northern Ireland was. Emma, next slide, please. Basically, we went 5th to the 10th. It was packed itinerary. Made some very good contacts, and basically it was productive. It was worthwhile. It was informative. But I think the good thing that came from it, that there was a good team building event for the Northern Ireland stakeholders to really integrate all our interests together and to try to agree on a way forward for the future. But the one key thing that we came home with, everybody said, please don't run at this before you can even crawl. And that was the thing, and we'll come on to that shortly. So Emma, next one. I think I'll just skip the next one. That's just the context to show that compared to Northern Ireland, the size of the industry compared to Norway is minuscule. But basically, we met a lot of companies. We're not going to go through them. We're going to talk about the hubs that they're members of. But the only one company we want to raise here is Salt Ship Design. When they were offered by industry the chance to come and do a presentation to us, they said no, because you're coming over here thinking everything's going to be rosy. You're going to come back in your back pocket with a system that's going to suit every one of your different stakeholders in fishing boats. That's not the case. He said, we don't want to be the pessimists. So we call them effectively the pessimists. So they came over and they said, look, they have worked on various ship designs, power plants, and they've looked at LNG, diesel, battery and flywheel powers. That list there, the hydrogen, diesel, battery power, hybrids, LNG and diesel, dual fuel, ammonia, methanol and nuclear. But what they were saying at present, there is no single alternative to diesels for what they call larger vessels. So I think we all agreed on that at the minute. So Emma, sorry again. But basically in Norway, it's structured. They seem to have clusters of companies and industry and government working together as a hub. And one of the hubs we met in Floro, which is that was north of Bergen, was the Ocean Cluster Hub. It has 170 odd members of businesses. It was established a decade ago, and they are taking the lead to be responsible for introducing hydrogen to the marine environment. And they're not looking just at the propulsion of a boat. They've looked at energy, supply, production, storage, ship design, and bunkering and all that. But they say that hydrogen seems to be the way forward in Norway, where in 2020 there was a very, very small number of planning applications in Norway for hydrogen storage plants, and last year there were 50 applications. So we're not getting into the detail. We can talk about detail, but just with the timescales. So next one, Emma, please. The other hub we seen was a group called Zero Kist or Zero Coast, and they've been working on a range of, powering vessels, zero emissions, supply of hydrogen, bunkering, charging, knowledge building, trying to get more information on what is, what can be done. But they say there's only one solution at the minute, which, if you exclude wind, wave, solar, electricity is the one. But they believed the batteries themselves were not sufficient and they needed an additional energy to boost the electrical system. And they were proposing that hydrogen at the minute is the best place to be. So they've looked at a whole rake of different sort of powered vessels, which has been mentioned here already: generators, power packs, battery packs, etc. But they are basing their optimism for the future on what the man called the Joker. And we sort of scratched our heads and said, what's this? He says, well, it's something that we don't know what it is yet. We don't know whether it will ever be introduced. But he took his iPhone out of his pocket and said, there you go. He says, 2 years before the iPhone was invented, you didn't think that was a solution to communication problems. So they're still hopeful that there's something out there that may be introduced that makes this better and more simplistic for the industry to adapt. But yet they don't know what that is. So basically, Emma, thanks. Quick summary of the main lessons. That was taken from about a 3/4 hour presentation, just but the main lessons we learned: Norway has done a lot of work in the field of zero carbon and net zero emissions for the maritime sector. They are developing electrical and hydrogen infrastructure at the minute in unison, improving electric powered and also trying to augment it by introducing hydrogen in a smaller capacity in those boats. They suggest that longer streamlined hulls are necessary for low energy consumption. Basically, again, other colleagues have said here, we need a bigger boat to store alternatives to diesel, etc. And they're saying that the legislation that governing fishing should be addressed to encourage any new boats to be more slender and streamlined and energy efficient in the future. So again, they said that at the minute, the zero or very low carbon emission alternatives to hydrocarbons are not available and unlikely to be in the near future for larger vessels on voyages of more than 24 hours or fast vessels on voyages of more than 1 hour because of the high energy requirements. So they're saying they're not available yet and are unlikely to be there in the future. Again, people have said today, electrification of our fishing industry needs a big upgrade in the electrical grid for fast and rapid charging. And if hydrogen is to be used as a fuel, there's a huge amount of investment required in infrastructure to make that happen, to store, to transport hydrogen, and to provide the bunkering facilities that would be needed. Emma. Thank you. So we did go to a battery factory, but the state-of-the-art battery-powered vessels have been developed, but they're more at the minute the likes of set courses such as the Hurtigruten ferries between islands. They are now a lot of them are turning purely electrical vessels. It is more suited to smaller vessels under with trips of 12 hours of less. But again, they believe that there should also be, for safety reasons, an additional means of propulsion should the electrics fail on those vessels. So the fishing modes most suitable for electrification and hydrogen are static gear and seining. Trolling and dredging naturally require higher power energy, and at this time the only source of energy for those modes is hydrocarbons. So basically that is the summary. I'll not go there, but genuine and visible working together was very, very clear, and that's something we're trying to generate in Northern Ireland. My final slide, I think, Emma, and then we'll pass over to Fiona. This basically was used by our Deputy Director in the presentation, and it sums up some of the key points. The availability of alternative fuels will remain limited for many years. An efficient fishing vessel must land its catch in the most convenient harbour, and being limited to a few harbours for bunkering purposes will result in higher energy consumption for many boats and reduced profitability. In terms of reliability, all alternative fuels except liquefied gas require new technology, which is still under development and to be tested on board vessels operating in sheltered waters and predictable routes. A safe fishing vessel depends on reliable power generation, which is natural because they're operating all year round in remote and not pleasant fishing areas and sometimes are removed from shelter. Safety, rules and regulations on how to handle and store explosive or toxic fuels in a safe manner is still under development. Safety aspects are particularly challenging in small vessels with personnel working on deck and often visit densely populated harbours. And again, what's mentioned by a few people today, affordability. The nature of fishing is unpredictable, as is the energy consumption and bunkering intervals. A fishing vessel will hence need a large energy storage relative to the vessel size, which is another major cost driver, as all streamlined, as alternative fuels have lower energy density than diesel and will require a larger vessel. Again, final 2 points, the fishing vessel needs a relatively high installed power to ensure safe handling of the fishing gear in demanding situations. Installed power is a major cost driver for the transition to alternative fuels. And the final point, much of the technology is not commercially available yet, which makes the cost level of a potential future investment very, very uncertain. And that includes the likes of the bunkering price for alternative fuels. It's expected in Norway to be much higher than for diesel for many years. So fishing vessels have limited possibilities for long-term fuel contracts from single suppliers due to limited availability. So that was a very, very quick, because of the times, trying to leave time for questions. That's a very quick run through of the key lessons and we learned from Norway. So I'll pass over to Fiona just to go on the last couple of 3 slides just on the climate action plan and how that links into it.
Fiona, do you need the slides or are you all right just
to have
a quick chat through?
Do you have the slides? Just continue on from where
I do. Do you mind trying to keep it brief just because we've run a bit over? Is that all right?
I'll start talking while you're sorting out the slides. So Yeah, that's grand. Is that the first slide? Oh,
Yeah.
nope.
I think, oh no.
Okay, so my name is Fiona Taylor and I'm head of Sea Fisheries Policy and Grants in Northern Ireland. And I just wanted to talk a bit about what the department in Northern Ireland are doing in terms of reducing emissions. So firstly, that starts with our Climate Act Northern Ireland of 2022, and that sets a target of net zero by 2050. For the fishing industry, further to the trip to Norway, you know, our fact-finding trip that Ronnie has just spoken about, industry has commissioned a naval architect to design a net zero fishing vessel, and phase 1 of that is now complete, and the multidisciplinary team led by industry hope to take the concept to build and demonstration phases, so they hope to achieve funding to do that. Our industry in Northern Ireland have been quite proactive in many respects around reducing emissions, and one of the projects that the industry are involved in is working with science and academia on a project to look at the interaction of fishing gears on the seabed, and this will help to inform novel gear designs and fishing practices that reduce contact with the seabed. Next slide, please, Emma. So part of our Climate Change Act requires DAERA to make regulations that set carbon budgets, and that's a carbon budget is the maximum total amount of emissions permitted for a budgetary period, and our first period is from 23 to 27. So our first consultation on the carbon budget has now been launched and is live at the moment, and that will run for 16 weeks in total until the 11th of October. And as well as consulting on the carbon budget, DAERA is seeking views on the Climate Change Committee's report, The Path to Net Zero, and that can all be found on the DAERA website. Next slide, please, Emma. So I had already mentioned that the Climate Change Act sets out a target of a net zero by at least 2050, and it also requires the development and consultation on and the publication of Northern Ireland's first climate action plan by the end of this year. So that is in draft form at the moment and will be going out to consultation by the end of the year. And there is a fisheries component to that. There are also specific requirements in DAERA to develop and publish sectoral plans, and that includes a fisheries sectoral plan. Again, that will be more focused on the fisheries policies. Next slide, please, Emma. So some of the higher level objectives that we are proposing in our climate action plan, DAERA will invest in a range of research and development projects to assess the most suitable technologies for the fishing subsectors. And the department also plans to invest in a range of other research initiatives that will help achieve decarbonisation of the fleet. And that's the early sort of stages of the proposals. And then by 2027, DAERA will develop a plan for a rollout of electrification, zero carbon fuels, retrofits to vessels, modifications, and that will all be in collaboration with industry, based on consultation and also based on research and what best fits the industry for Northern Ireland. So early days yet, but that's the sort of long-term plan for this, and that's everything from me. Tried to do it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. Thank you. I think we've caught out with this topic. Just before we go on to Mike Cohen, I'm just going to say that we are finishing at 5. But if we don't get to any Q&As, if we email Emma at FIT, link people together to continue this discussion, and we do apologise if we don't get to Q&A. It's still fascinating hearing from principals. So I'm going to quickly introduce you to Mike Cohen. He's Chief Executive of the NFFO. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks very much. I will try and crack through this quite quickly because I'm really just here to introduce what we're doing rather than to give a detailed rundown. Vessels of the Future Forum is something that I'm chairing with support from Seafish to bring together a whole bunch of people, many of whom are on the call today, who have an interest in various different ways in looking at alternative ways to fuel fishing boats. The NFFO has been interested in this for quite some time. We commissioned the report that Magnus described, and the great work that Magnus and his team did kind of led to more within the Federation. We recognised the need as representatives of the catching sector to get involved in the conversation around net zero more. I think very often when it comes to environmental issues, the fishing industry, fishing sector, it is talked at rather than listened to, and we too often follow agendas that the people. And on this issue, really, I think fishing already has a good story to tell. We produce one of the lowest carbon sources of protein in the human food chain, and that tends to get ignored. And we are held to a very high standard of environmental propriety because of what we do, because it is so, I think, misunderstood, as well as being something that people don't tend to engage with. Actually producing food, the dirty job of producing food and putting it on people's plates. So we have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards too. We have to engage with the issues that are out there around climate change, because it's expected of us. Because if we don't, then we run the risk of an industry that is increasingly expensive and inefficient to maintain as it is, and simply because it is the right thing to do, and that is widely recognised by people within our industry. Climate change is a reality. There is an issue that has to be tackled, and it is the right thing to do to try and make our industry more efficient in order to tackle that, as well as it being simply economically the sensible thing to do. So the Vessels of the Future Forum aims to bring people together who have something to contribute to that discussion. People like those who are involved. Just looking at the top of my screen, I think most people are involved in it in one way or another. Duncan's there, Cara's there, lots of other people here who have something to contribute, either because they're involved in trying to design solutions, because they are thinking around the regulatory technicalities, because they've tried creating systems or vessels that are going to contribute to the future. So we aim to bring people together to foster those discussions and to tackle problems. The idea is for it to be very kind of task and solution oriented, not just a talking shop, but a way of bringing people with expertise together to come up with novel solutions and to help one another to reach new heights in what they're doing. We're creating a knowledge hub to try and bring together all of the, or as much as possible, of the existing knowledge on these issues, so that we are not seeing people repeatedly trying to reinvent the wheel, but able to build on what's gone before and to carry it further. We're going to be working future as a sort of hub and spoke model, with a central forum meeting only maybe 3 times a year, but working groups of people with expertise in a particular area going off to tackle particular issues that were identified. So we'll have a group looking at the skills and training required to service new kinds of vessels. We'll have a group looking at the infrastructure necessary to make it possible to fuel vessels with alternative ways. We'll be having a group looking specifically at propulsion systems, others looking at, there'll be lots of different specific working groups aiming to complete particular projects, bring them back to the central forum to share what they've learned, to get advice and to move on. A crucial thing in that, and it's one that's come up with a couple of people already, is that we aren't simply trying to look at, our goal is not just to move straight to trying to produce a vessel that doesn't use diesel, because as repeatedly been said today, that isn't going to happen. We need to look at the other options for reducing our reliance purely on fossil fuels. There are a number of technologies out there already that are promising and at various different stages of feasibility. I've seen Jason from Ecomotors here somewhere in the crowd as well, and they're doing remarkable work with systems that reduce the reliance on diesel of vessels that already have diesel engines in. There's lots of innovative technology out there that will provide that stepping stone towards systems that don't require fossil fuels. And a really important thing that the Vessels of the Future Forum needs to do is to manage the expectations of those outside the industry. We are not suddenly going to come up with electric fishing boats for every scale from 5 meters to over 100. We are going to have solutions at a variety of different stages that will get us to that end goal. So that's our mission. It's bringing people together to kind of cross-pollinate ideas to try and grow what we can achieve and try to put some projects in motion that will lead us through to the next steps. Lots of people on the call are involved in that and are involved in the practicalities of it. My job really is just the bringing people together and helping the conversation to move along. Very quick whistle-stop tour through all of that. If people want to ask questions about it, you can always get hold of me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's obviously we're going to run out of time for Q&As, but we have got David Fennell and Benjamin Craig from the MCA on the call. And it'd be great to finish off with David and Ben on where the MCA sit with all our issues within the industry. And yet again, just before we start, if anybody wants to contact anybody, we can communicate through Emma at Fishing into the Future via email. So we're not just going to leave you in the lurch at 5:30. We can continue this on after the call. So I'd like to hand over now to David and Benjamin. It's up to you who wants to go first, Ben or David. Thank you.
Me going first. So it's Dave Fenner. It'd be a very, very quick canter through for everybody. Can you just check you can hear me? Yeah, cool. That's good. It'd be a very, very quick canter through. There is a presentation that I provided to Emma, and I'm more than happy for her to share that afterwards as well, so that if anybody wants to see, because there'll be points on there that I won't cover here. I think as well, I'd just like to sort of start by saying that it was interesting to hear from Hans and Douglas about their experience in developing new systems for their boats as well, and undoubtedly they went through the MCA process, and I suspect it probably wasn't easy for them because everybody was learning at the time, and that includes ourselves as well. But I think, you know, with the likes of Hans and Douglas and others that follow him, it's going to make life an awful lot easier for everybody else that does follow in the future, because the lessons will be learned and people will understand the systems more, and will just make the ability to progress these things that much more of a more acceptable process for everybody. Because obviously what we're coming from is a base where we develop rules for diesel engines. Basically, we do have some stuff still for steam boilers, I think, as well, but the rules we've got at the moment are very prescriptive. That they're based on old, you know, the current technology that we've been around for over 100 years now, and they're not really, they just don't fit what people are trying to do at the moment. You know, the fueling systems are different. There are different risks with the fuels. Douglas has talked about some of those areas. Duncan's talked about some of those areas already. So there's so many things that are at variance with the rules that we've got, and we need to then basically speak to everybody new, everybody that's wanted to do these things, to understand what they are proposing and how they can work. What we've got out there at the moment is an MGN, which is an evolving MGN 644, which I think has taken a few amendments already to identify what people need to do in terms of the process, and really it's the process that I want to cover off today, because it is evolving, and I'm going to cover it in brief. There's a little bit more detail in the presentation. Obviously there's a load more detail in the guidance note itself, but I mean the most important thing obviously is speak to the Marine Office in the first instance, discuss what the proposal is. There might be the need for equivalencies. There's a form for that, which is an MSF 1261, explaining why you can't comply with the current regs, what alternative provisions there are. Obviously, when we're satisfied that any of these risks are mitigated to an acceptable level, then the certificate is issued. What we do is we look at various requirements when they're coming in. So we look at that for the basis of the approval. That could take the form of what's in the applicable regulations already. You could take things from alternative references, other codes or standards, good practice elsewhere. Also, what control measures you put in place around the risk assessments to reduce the safety risk, address any environmental or security risks as well. So as far as practicable, it would need to demonstrate the compliance with the existing requirements, but also standards that or alternative references. Generally, you need to discuss those alternative references with the MCA as well, and then provide some comprehensive requirements that you set down, including the scope and the justification for the use of those as well. What you also need to provide is what's called a certification plan. Again, that's set out further in MGN 644. That will include, as I mentioned, the analysis of what you intend to do, the risk assessment, and what alternative design requirements are there. And I think that's a very brisk walkthrough. These key essentials are: look at MGN 644, speak to the MCA up front, have a look at the references that you can use, and set them down, and work with the MCA on these, because we're learning just the same as everybody else is learning as well. And the more information that we've got, the more it helps yourself and the more it helps people that follow in the future. And that's a real very quick run through because time is pressing. So I've probably left out quite a bit that was probably important as well, but just to keep it in time. But the presentation should help a lot of people if they read that, and I'm happy to speak to people outside of this as well.
Okay,
Right.
thanks. Do you want to finish up then, Ben, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so my role at the MCA is less on the actually the approving vessels side, and so I specifically look at trying to figure out which technology is going to be most useful for which ship types in future, and then building and assimilating that understanding, because it is very varied across the whole fleet. I've got a bit of a domestic focus as well, and then trying to make sure those considerations are then represented into policymakers, and also through a continuous engagement with the industry. And I have to say that today's session has been one of the best decarb sessions I've been to in a long time. I wasn't actually aware of all of these technical, the fully in-depth technical stuff going on for some sectors. I've done some of that myself, and it's very clear I'm not going to have to for this. So it's absolutely brilliant. So I'll be sharing those reports widely within government, and making sure that we capture the lessons learned, and also most definitely engaging with the fishing community very soon, I expect. And I can probably leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thank you, David. Obviously, we're running out of time. Emma's going to put up her email to everybody, and it's obviously we need to come back to this topic, and Fishing into the Future will look at this topic in the future. Sorry we couldn't get to Q&As, and thank you for all your time to be on this call tonight. It is certainly a topic that we can continue, but we can link people together. That's what Fishing into the Future does. So yeah, again, I would thank everybody that's been on the call and patience. It's the first time we've done an hour and a half. I think we could have done 2 hours, but we've started a conversation within the fishing industry, and it's thanks to the MCA that they've joined us today. And other speakers. So I'm just going to let Emma finish off the call, but from me, thank you very much.
Yeah, we've never had so many interesting speakers that we've not got to the Q&A, so I'm terribly sorry about that, because it is also quite a nice, it's a chunky topic, I guess. If you want to be put in touch with anyone, you can message me. I've put it in the chat, but it's emma@fitf.co.uk. If you have things you want me to share, I can put them on the Fishing Porthole website as well, which is our website, which is a one-stop shop for the fishing industry. So we'll have lots of information on there. Sorry we don't get to the Q&A today, but I think everyone will agree that all the speakers have just been brilliant and have really given a lot of information, and we're happy to link you up otherwise. So everyone get on with your evening. Enjoy. Thanks for joining, especially the people who are at sea. That's just always brilliant to see people who are out and about and just still keeping their finger on the pulse. So I'll say goodbye to you all and take care. See you at the next one.
Emma, can you hear me still?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
See the slide that was the two vans with Hans and the fishing boat. Can you just pop that up for a second? Is that all right? Can you do that?
Picture, right?
Yeah, the picture of it's two electric vans and an electric fishing boat, and it's the bit of optimism that should be right at the very end of this.
Okay, I got
Can
it.
you manage that?
I think I've got it. Is that the optimism for you?
Yeah, so that is a horse and cart pier on the west coast of Scotland. That's Hans' uncle's with his solar-powered electric fishing boat. We've been out diving, and he's about to go creel fishing, and that's two electric vans delivering the catch and also taking materials onto the boat. So that's the future.
That is the future. Thanks for the hope, Douglas.
Yeah, and that's happening right now.
Brilliant. It's good to see. It gives us some hope and a nice positive note to end on.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.